I'm Sarah Wilson and you're listening to the Roots and All podcast. I'm here to help you get growing. Join me as I explore everything plant related both indoors and out and provide the information you need to create your perfect green environment. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the podcast. It's time for what is, without a doubt, my favourite garden job, bar none. And my favourite job involves one of my favourite plants, which is the rose. I wanted to find out all there is to know about pruning roses, and of course I couldn't go anywhere else than the rose experts at David Austin. This week I'm speaking to Richard Stubbs, who currently works as the trade manager at David Austin, but who's worked in pretty much every department there, including as the head gardener of the 2-acre show garden. Richard lectures, designs and advises all over the world, and what he doesn't know about roses you can write on the back of a stamp and still have room to lick it. I asked him about which roses need pruning and which don't, when to do it, how to do it and how not to do it. Plus, I got some inside information on why you shouldn't leave the label on a rose when you plant it. He started by giving an overview of the different types of roses you are likely to find in a garden.
A lot of people nowadays have the David Austin shrub roses. Hybrid teas were very popular in the 60s and 70s. So a lot of people nowadays have grown up knowing those roses because the parents had them in the gardens. So hybrid teas, although they're not as popular as they used to be, still are fairly popular. They're the big ugly things with very stiff stems and big flower on the top. Only one or two flowers a stem. You've got floribundas, a bit similar to hybrid teas but with lots of flowers on, and they tend to be quite brightly coloured. You've got miniatures and patios, which are smaller versions of the floribundas. And then you've got the big prickly rugosa roses, they're shrubs, and the climbers and ramblers. Climbers tend to be big flowers and quite stiff. Ramblers are, as they say, ramble about and have lots of little flowers.
And is it possible that some shrub roses act a bit like climbers?
I mean, you can get shrub roses that will actually climb if you leave them to unpruned. So things like Claire Austin, Gertrude Ducal, Shropshire Lad, they're all introduced as shrubs, but if you let them grow, they become climbers. So they are the same plant, but just pruned differently.
So are there any of those that don't need pruning?
No, the only roses that don't need pruning are wild roses. So you plant those and forget them.
Right.
But apart from that, the vast majority of roses need pruning.
Okay. And when should we be pruning?
Ideally, in the UK, you should prune when they're most dormant, so between Christmas and the end of February.
Perfect. And is it the end of the world if you do it before or after?
Well, if you do it too early and you have a mild winter like this year, you start to grow. So basically, if you have a cold January or something and you prune them in November, you can damage the rose. And if you prune them too late, after they've started to shoot quite readily, then you're telling the plant you want it to stop growing when it's growing, and it gets a bit confused and sends out spindly, weak shoots, and generally tend to have the flowers that flop. So if you prune late, that's the consequence.
And is there any pruning that should be done in the summer?
Well, not in this country. In hot countries where they grow very tall, then you can summer prune them. But in the UK, unless if you get the odd long shoot that looks silly, then there's no harm in pruning. And you can prune a little bit in the autumn if you live in a very exposed place and the roses are quite tall, then I would just reduce them a little bit before the winds in autumn.
Getting into the actual process of pruning, is it different for those different types of roses that you talked about?
It is slightly different, yes. Shrub roses you probably don't prune as much as hybrid teas, but hybrid teas you cut right back, almost sort of 6 to 12 inches from the ground. Everything else, if you cut them in half, you wouldn't really go wrong. But obviously, not the climbers and ramblers.
No. Okay. And with the climbers and ramblers, what would you do to those?
Well, climbers and ramblers, you spend the first 3 years of them growing to build up a sort of structure. So you want to train them as outwards as possible, so to create a sort of fan shape framework, and then you just cut the side shoots that flower back to that framework each winter. The important thing is to try and bend the stems as horizontally as possible, because that encourages flowers lower down, and then just keep that structure.
Okay. Is that the same with ramblers?
Yeah, ramblers, ideally, you should have put them in a place where they can ramble and don't actually need much pruning at all. But if you put them in the wrong place, you have to restrict them, then because most of them only flower once, you have to try and keep the new growth they make, take the old growth out, so you've got space for the new growth to go. Because ramblers flower on the stems they produced the previous season. So if you cut all the new growth off, you tend to restrict the flowering greatly.
And when you've got your climbers and ramblers, if you've got, as you say, that framework,
Yes.
so it fills the space that you want, and then you want it to stop going out any further, is it just a case of pruning each lateral stem each year?
You cut the fit, cut the fit, basically.
Okay. Yeah. And how about the rugosa roses? Are they the same as shrub roses?
Yeah, well, they are shrub roses. The shrub roses are a huge family, so lots of variations within that. Rugosa roses, a lot of people say don't prune them. But the problem with rugosas is they go very woody if you let the stems get old. So I would suggest you cut them back by about a third. But once they're established, sort of 4 or 5 years old, you take about a third of the old stems out each year. So you're always promoting new stems to come through.
And is that the same principle with shrub roses? Would you cut out as much of the old?
Shrub roses, once they're established, take 2 or 3 stems out every year. Take the oldest stems and keep, because that keeps promoting new stems, so keeps the plant young. And old stems tend to be very rough, and black spot spores and disease spores can overwinter in those rough stems. So the nearer the stem, the less black spot spores and fungal spores sit on them. So hopefully, therefore, you get less problems.
Yeah, they always look lovely and clean and green, don't they? The new shoots.
Yeah.
What are the tenets of rose pruning? Is it the 3 Ds?
Yeah. So you take dead, diseased, and damaged stems out. You take any very weak stems out. And it's particularly important to take any weak, spindly, little stems that have leaves but nothing else on out of the centre of the plant at the base. So the base, in the centre of the base of the rose, it should be clear completely. So no little stems, because congestion causes disease. And then that's basically it. It's just keeping that plant young. So take whole stems out, cut back by roughly a half, take the 3 Ds out, keep the middle clean, and that's about it, really.
Yeah. If you have a particular stem that's growing inwards into the plant and you want to remove it, and ideally you don't want it to come back, do you just cut it right at the base where it meets the stem it's coming off?
Yeah, if you cut all stems back as far as possible, but if it's quite a new stem but it's growing in the wrong place, if you cut it back to a bud that's facing the way you want it to grow, then cut it just above there, and then when it shoots again, it'll go outwards rather than inwards. But with the centre of the rose, as long as they're good strong stems at the top of then we don't worry too much about the centre. It's really at the base of the plant that's the important bit. We tend not to worry too much about crossing stems unless they're rubbing and damaging each other. Then we would take one out. But if they're not rubbing, then again, not really a problem on a shrub rose, because they produce so many stems. We're not trying to create a chalice shape like you are in a hybrid tea.
And how about the ground cover roses? Should you do anything with those?
Ground cover roses are very easy. Just take a pair of shears to them and just trim them. So or you can probably keep them. Just leave them alone completely, apart from just clearing out some dead dead stems underneath the plant. They're very easy to look after, ground covers.
And is it true about cutting with a slant?
We don't bother too much. In all honesty, the hand naturally cuts at a slant. When you've got a pair of secateurs in your hand, you tend to always cut in a slant anyway. The human hand doesn't operate at 90 degrees. It operates at probably 45 degrees normally. So, and this old adage of stopping the little drop of water sitting on top of the stem and freezing, you very rarely see any water on top of a rose stem. It really doesn't matter. They're very tough plants, roses. And even if you got a little bit of frost damage at the top of the stem, they'd only die back to the first bud.
Right.
So it's absolute, no need for it. It's a bit like the outward facing bud thing. Again, in shrub roses, they shoot from left, right, front, back, wherever they want to. So it has no consequence. So don't worry about that.
Okay. And would you recommend disinfecting your secateurs in between different bushes?
Yeah, definitely. It's good garden hygiene, really. I mean, whether it makes any difference is debatable, but it's just good practice, really.
Yeah. And when you mentioned the dieback, how far do you have to cut down a stem to make sure that you've cut that out properly?
Well, you tend to see if it's got dieback on the stem, it tends to be brown in the middle of the stem. So if you cut back below the dieback and make sure the centre of the stem is white or pale green, then that means you've got it all out.
So I've inherited some roses recently at a garden that I'm working in, and they are pretty old. And some of them are they're literally one healthy stem, and the rest is dead. Can anything be done with them? Can they be saved?
Well, roses have a life, so a good life is 25 years, really. The average rose would last between 15 and 25 years. So if they're older than that, they're not very vigorous. There's very little you can do. So the best thing is to dig out and replace. So if you get an old rose that's really quite vigorous, produces lots of flowers, but it just is out of shape, then you can cut it right back to sort of 6 inches from the ground, and they will shoot from very old stems. Even if you can't see a bud on that stem, it will be there, and it's worth doing that to try and get all the new shoots coming back up again. So as we call it, a kill or cure prune. So it vast majority of cases it works, but in the odd case it doesn't, and they just die. But yeah, in your case, when you've got an odd single stem and they're not particularly vigorous, then there's not a lot you can do. The best thing that you see with old roses, they tend to be more prone to disease anyway. So fungal diseases tend to spread in the wind and the rain. So if you've got one bad rose that gets black spot every year, it can infect even really good roses. So it's best to get rid.
Yeah, fair enough. So a thing I quite often observe in gardens is that if someone's planted a new rose and they've left the label around one of the stems,
it always dies, doesn't it?
It does. Yeah.
It's a mystery. We've tried all sorts of different materials for the labels, but it's always the case. My theory is they just don't like the label tends to be sat in one place, so it must block the light out on that little bit of stem. So I think that's probably either that or there's something in the label that affects the growth. But it's always the case, always has been.
So
and we've tried all sorts. Yeah.
I'm glad it's not just me then.
Very, very strange. I mean, the other thing is the original plant you get is a bit like a starter motor. So quite often that original plant won't last very long, but it will send up brand new shoots from the graft in the first few years after you planted it. So that sort of the original plant doesn't tend to last that long.
Right.
So perhaps that's another reason why you notice it.
Yeah.
But it is a fact. It is a fact that.
Yeah, I think, and also when I notice that roses have been tied in on a frame, quite
Yeah,
often
that's
the
the other
stem
thing.
that's been tied
Yeah,
in will die as well.
that's why we sort of we recommend that flexi tie.
Yeah.
It's like expandable rubber. It expands as the rose grows, whereas wire and string dent and cut into the stem.
Mm.
So that's another reason why. But yeah, they don't like. We try and tie as little as possible. So if you've got a tie on, and then next year it grows, move the tie a bit further up and take the original tie off. So you're only tying it once or twice.
And I must ask you this as well, actually, while I'm on the silly questions trail. I quite often, people say to me, oh, well, they did a trial where you can cut roses with a chainsaw and they flower just as well.
Yeah.
Is there anything against doing that as a practice?
Well, there's a few things that sort of put you off. I mean, I used to prune the David Austin garden with a hedge cutter, but we don't do it now. And there's a few reasons. It doesn't actually save any time because the problem with using a hedge cutter is all the long stems drop into the centre of the plant. So you have to get your hand in there and take them out and everything. Also, if you don't go follow around pruning actually properly, the centre of the plant gets very congested. You get lots of dead stems. So if you don't go in there and actually clean those out, you just promote disease. So if you get hedge cutters are great if you've got a big block of roses you want to create a nice shape. So for instance, we recommend planting in say to groups of 3 or 4 or 5 or rather than a single plant. You can prune them like one plant. So when they're established, if you use a hedge cutter, you can get a nice shape on them, which is easier to do with a hedge cutter than it is individual secateurs. But then we would always go round and prune them individually afterwards, or prune them properly. So you can use a hedge cutter, but you've got to use a pair of secateurs afterwards. So it doesn't really save any time.
No. And what would happen if you didn't prune your roses at all?
Well, if they're not going to die, they just get very misshapen. Again, you get the dead and everything like that in congestion in the middle of the plant. You get disease, so they just wouldn't perform to what they could do. So they're pruning, you're keeping them young, so you get more flowers, keeping a nice shape, so it looks nice. So if you don't prune, they go out of shape. They don't perform as well as they could.
What should we do once we have pruned our roses? Do they need any special treatment afterwards?
No, basically clear up the soil. So take any old leaves, any stems left on the floor. Even if you've mulched your ground with bark or anything like that, take all that off and put new on. So you're taking away any disease that's overwintered on the bark or on anything like that away from, and then apply rose food and then a mulch on afterwards. So once you've cleaned everything, I mean, you can spray the stems with a fungicide if you really want to, but we don't encourage people to use chemicals too much if we can avoid it. But the main thing is clearing up and cleaning everything up. So you start again basically with nice clean soil. So you put a mulch on after that, and then if there is any spores left, that mulch will cover them up.
So if you didn't want to use any fungicides or anything, are there any other treatments that could work against black spot, because it is a pain?
Well, there's a few more of these sort of garlic-based insecticides, and because garlic has a very high sulfur content, sulfur tends to kill black spot spores. There is some thinking behind that they may have some effect against black spot, but it's yet to be proved. There's no real organic method of stopping black spot apart from making sure you choose the best varieties and making sure you keep them growing as strongly and healthily as possible. A bit like humans, if you eat well and look after yourself, and you're less likely to get disease. So it's all about, if you've got a variety that is very prone to black spot, you could spray it daily with anything you care to imagine, it'll still get black spot.
Are there any varieties, particularly I'm thinking in the shrub roses and maybe the climbers, that genuinely don't get black spot?
Well, I mean, yes, there's a number of the newer varieties, things like Olivia Rose Austin, Princess Anne, in the climbers, Generous Gardener, Claire Austin. Genuinely, you can't 100% guarantee they don't get it, but they're extremely healthy. Mortimer Settler's another one, Bathsheba. So there's a number of roses now. There's more and more coming on stream that are coming through that are very resistant to disease.
And I must just ask you about suckers. How would you know if you had them, and what should you do with them?
Right, well, suckers are not as common as they used to be, because the modern root stocks we use are generally don't produce many suckers. Suckers tend to come from a little way away from the plant, because they're coming off the roots, and they don't come from the centre of the rose. They always come from underground because they're coming off the root. They are bright green stems. They don't have many thorns, but the thorns are more like needles than rose thorns. They have dull, small, rounded leaves with a serrated edge. So they're very different to most modern roses. If there's any redness in the stem or in the leaf or anything like that, not a sucker. And the big old wives' tale is all suckers have 7 leaves and nothing else does. Well, most shrub roses will have 5, 7, 3, 9, any amount of leaves. So don't think if your rose has got 7 leaves, it's automatically a sucker. In the vast majority of cases, it won't be. It's new growth. So don't cut it off. And if you're not sure, email a picture to David Austin's or ask an expert at a local garden centre, but don't cut them off before you ask.
And I remember hearing that about ramblers and climbers as well, that was how you tell the difference.
So again, 7 leaves. The vast majority of ramblers have 7 leaves at least, and they send huge long shoots out each year that often look quite like suckers actually. So you do have to be careful, but the main thing is that kind of needle-like thorn as against the normal rose thorn, like triangular rose thorn, and they're very dull green leaves. They're pretty obvious when you see them. On ramblers, they can be difficult because the rambler growth is quite sucker-like.
Are there any sort of common mistakes that you see people make when they're pruning that kind of makes you want to tear your hair out?
Most people are frightened of pruning because they've read the books, and the books make it sound so complicated. They're sort of frightened. So they always under prune. So they always leave it too high. So that's sort of the main problem. Very few people cut them back too hard. On a shrub rose, you'll get your old traditional gardeners that are used to hybrid teas, and they'll cut their shrub roses just like a hybrid tea, so they cut them way down low, which in consequence makes the new stems go up very quickly and very soft, and when you get the big heads on, they flop. So that's a common mistake as well. So pruning too hard, well, that's mainly gardeners that do that, because they were classically trained by RHS and things like that. So they're just not used to the modern sort of techniques. They just treat everything like a hybrid tea. That's not an uncommon. People think they're going to kill the rose if you prune it too much. So the one big thing to remember is you won't kill a rose by pruning it. You might ruin its shape, you might stop it flowering, but you never kill it. So don't be frightened. So generally, most shrub roses, certainly the David Austin ones, the vast majority grow between 3.5 and 4.5 feet. So if you cut any of those varieties down to about 18 inches to 2 feet, you can't really go wrong.
That's good. I mean, I quite often find that the eventual height and spread measurements are on the conservative side.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, it's an average. We're giving people a guideline because they are very, you can't say it's going to go to 2 feet and then stop, or 4 foot and then stop. It's just a guideline because a lot depends on how you look after them, your soil condition, weather, all sorts of things go into how plants grow. So we can only give a guideline.
Fair enough. You mentioned books, actually. Have you got a book that's your favourite if someone was looking to read up on this?
The one book I quite like, and because it's fairly easy to follow, is the Alan Titchmarsh How to Grow Roses.
Okay.
Because it's fairly cheap. It's softback, and it's very easy to sort of look at, and with lots of things, diseases and all sorts. It covers everything.
Mhm.
So I think that as a beginner's book, I think that's quite good. But apart from that, there's no real book on pruning. You can get the overall, the RHS pruning book that covers everything. So specific rose pruning, it's so easy, you see, you can't make a book out of it. Probably too short.
Yeah. Okay, so I was going to ask you to finish. Have you got, I don't know if you're allowed to say actually, but have you got any interesting varieties coming up this year?
There are 2 new varieties that actually have gone on the website this weekend.
Okay.
So there's a yellow one and a pink one. The yellow one is got Scottish rose in its background, so it's very thorny. But there's a nice pink one called Silas Marner, it's got good fragrance, very healthy. And the yellow one's obviously very healthy as well. Nice scent, I think. But yes, so those 2 are available to order now, actually. They're launched at Chelsea, but they're available to order. I think we've got stock from beginning of March.
Oh, so you could get ahead of the curve there.
Yes, you
Yeah.
could. We generally have 2 or 3 new varieties each year.
Yeah. Well, interestingly, you mentioned the colours because that was going to be my last question. Have you noticed any trends over the last year, and are you predicting any kind of coming up?
If you could predict the public, you'd be a rich man. I don't think this. It does change. I think the yellows the yellow roses have always been the least popular.
Mm.
For some reason, people don't like yellow roses in the garden. I'm not quite sure. Pink's always popular. But the apricots and oranges have seemed to have been a bit more popular this year. Whether that's a trend or not, debatable.
I think it was. Everyone went a bit raving mad for pink, for like peaches and apricots over the last couple of years.
Yeah. So, but as a grower, of course, you're always 2 years behind.
Mm.
So it takes basically 2 years to grow a rose. So you're trying to anticipate what people might buy in 2 years' time, which is pretty impossible.
Yeah, I'll bet.
So that's why sometimes we run out of stuff, and other times we got too much of stuff. But that's one of those things.
Yeah.
You can never predict the public.
No, I'll bet. Okay, this is my last question, but I can't resist asking you, what's your favourite rose?
My favourite has probably been the same rose for the last sort of 3 or 4 months. That's Desdemona.
Oh, yeah, that's lovely.
I do like Lady Charlotte. Lady Charlotte's another one. And Olivia Rose Austin's very good. James Austin's impressed me. I've got some couple in a pot in my garden because I haven't got a garden anymore. I've just got gravel, so I've got a few in pots. And James Austin's been very good. So that's another one to take note of, I think.
Righty-ho, good, I will do. Well, I can't buy any more. It's like an addiction. Every time.
You did your lawn up.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good idea.
Grass is a waste of time. You have to mow it every week.
I couldn't agree more. I can't help it. I am a sucker for roses. I was talking to Richard after I stopped recording, and he said the key to rose pruning is to relax and enjoy it. And also, there's not much chance of it so far this year, but he mentioned that it's never too cold to prune them in this country. They pruned their roses on the David Austin nursery at -18 one year. I'd like to thank Richard for sharing his knowledge and also for being decisive enough to choose a favourite rose given the amount of varieties he's surrounded by every day. I couldn't choose. Can you? I'll catch you next Tuesday. You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website www.rootsandall.co.uk, where you'll also find my blog and a sign-up form for the newsletter, which gives you a weekly roundup of content, plus the inside scoop on things like upcoming guests. Or you can subscribe wherever you normally get your podcasts. Email me with comments and feedback at podcast@rootsandall.co.uk. Follow me on Twitter, Roots and All, Facebook, Roots and All UK, and Instagram, Roots and All Pod. But please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support my work, because if you like what I do, please help me to continue doing it. Even if you make a one-off donation of £1, trust me, it all helps, and I will be immensely grateful. So please go to Patreon and search for Roots and All.